everybody. I feel a bit nervous because this feels a bit like committing to an academic suicide. I don't know anything about animal law, environmental law, any of that stuff. But I'm into legal design, and that's kind of gave me this courage to maybe build some sort of connection between laws design and the field that you have been contributing to. First, I will propose some theoretical frames that we learned earlier today. Frames can be useful to think through legal agency of modern humans. I like to think law as some sort of design, activity and object. I'm drawing also from post-human theory and systems thinking. Then I will move on to the actual rethinking part, how different trends and approaches can help us rethink more than human legal agency. Then this will be the most entertaining section, I assume, where I will explore through different more than human design cases what this could be in practice, and then make some concluding remarks by making some proposals and also presenting some critical perspectives and concerns regarding using this sort of approach. So, since I admitted I've been studying animal law recently, the recently published article by Visa and Pauliina Siminek was kind of inspired me for many reasons, especially because I feel that it points towards thinking law as a design. That it is the presence or absence, as well as the extent of different agency enabling mechanisms and resources that kind of influence our agency. And like I said, I feel that that's a matter of design. Legal design, you may have heard about it before. It has kind of become a trendy thing. And people seem to define it in many ways. For me, legal design is about framing law ontologically as a designerly thing, which as such is of course not a very novel approach or way to think law. If we remember that in the philosophical categorization of different sciences, law is commonly understood as sort of a science of the betterment as a design, sort of design science. But why I find this framing helpful here and also in my PhD research is that I feel that it brings more clarity to observing law, and particularly law's developing mechanisms and different components and the material side of law that is our physical reality, and asks the critical question if law can be developed through developing its designing. I learned a lot during the first keynote, and I feel like I would like to change so many things on this slide, but just let it sit here. So in this presentation, let's adopt a more broad understanding of legal agency. Definitely, it's not something about that we maybe people traditionally understand. The ability to be a part of contracts or file a case at the court, but it's some sort of ability to shape the legal system by making or influencing legal decisions in situations, in cases that involve interests of those agents. And with more than human, it's also a very fuzzy concept. Should it really involve everything beyond the human? Here, I really like to focus on living beings and ecological systems, animal, plants, microorganisms, maybe leave out landscapes, rivers, and oceans. And such agencies that don't really seem to show like intelligent behavior. And more than human design, that's an approach of design that treats more than human beings as active participants in the design process, rather than just as resources or conditions. So there they definitely have adopted a very broad understanding of the agency of the more than human. And so my proposal, or the thing I want to explore, is that can we use this sort of approach to think whether such approach could help us in rethinking the more than human agency in law. What kind of aspects that could bring visible. And as said, post-human thinking, systems thinking can provide support or maybe a push in these considerations. They all like to kind of challenge the human-centric illusion of law and politics and also other forms of social life, that somehow the world would be human-centric and we humans would be in control of it. We of course do influence the whole, but in many harmful ways, and by but if we only pay attention to human interests and using humans and particular kind of humans as a sort of a measuring stick in designing the artificial, including the law, that is also the very reason that human influence has become so harmful. And that's also the reason why these human-designed systems like law have not really been successful in preventing and mitigating those harms. So through this critical lens, the core challenge in designing law in the Anthropocene is to overcome what I would call the observer's dilemma and explore beyond human perspectives to those of other forms of natural intelligences and their entanglements. Also through this lens, it becomes a bit more clear that we need to pay attention to the designing activity as itself, because itself is normative and ultimately shapes the material reality of justice, not only for us humans, but also for the more than human lives. So in order to make matter come into matter differently, which is a reference to Karen Parrott's title in her book, then, as Sandhuber and Hermansen suggest in their article on post-human legal design, we need to start designing law differently and consequently perhaps understanding some legal concepts framed differently, which would make and mark a more fundamental ontological turn in law. My feeling is that in its essence, if we consider law as an artificial, human designed thing, if we want that to better serve and function together with the more than human natural world and the reality, that would sort of mean making the law more natural, a law that is more living. And that is what I think include the expansion of the legal space to intentionally include more than human agencies, to let their influence in the legal system would mean, which is of course a very broad philosophical thing. As you probably know way better, there are more and more signs and evidence that show that the potential of more than human legal agency is being taken seriously, particularly due to the work of scholars, interest groups, and advocates for more than human rights and the ecology of law. And even the recent declarations for rights of nature and the acknowledgement of legal personhood of more than human beings by some national legislators and courts may be just symbolic, but in my view they kind of signal that this kind of ontological turn is happening, and there is it is possible to sort of work with this idea of expanding the more than humanism in the legal space. But interestingly, as Urki and Sieminek have pointed out in their article, there are some fundamental anthropocentric assumptions related to agency and legal agency in general. And in your article you discussed animal legal agency, so I'm not sure if it really fits this profile, but interesting to hear your opinion. But it is these assumptions that seem to hamper the development and the realization of more than human agency as a legal practice as well. And you call this the passivity assumption, which refers to the welfarist and paternalistic understanding that more than human legal agency can only be based on human representation. And maybe we can dilute that assumption into other assumptions that kind of are behind it. We have the muteness assumption, inspired by Sacco's Mute Law book, that there is no way to exchange information with more than humans in an equally meaningful way, which is then also called the norm. They have this norm psychology assumption in animal normativity studies that only humans can have the psychological ability to understand right and wrong, and this is, we got a really nice introduction earlier today as well. Also lastly, which seems to limit the development of human legal agency as well, is this individualism assumption that the qualifications for legal agency would somehow be static, that no, whatever the context, you either are a legal agent or you are not. Therefore, to me it seems that challenging and exploring beyond these assumptions seems to be a way forward to developing more than human agency in law. And next I will present a few potential paths or ways for these explorations. From the post-humanist legal design viewpoint, this non-linguistic and animal normativity studies can be particularly useful, not only to overcome the human-centered assumptions about normativity and agency, but also to maybe identify similarities between human and more than human normative behavior, sort of the commonalities in our way of designing or expressing the rules, which could then help imagine and design more than human inclusive legal practices, whatever those could be. For example, just like humans, some animals can have their specific interest species jurisdictions where they obtain certain rights. Research indicates that certain big birds create these sort of like territorial places where only one kind of alpha male rules over other alpha males of just the same species, so they don't have the right to interact each other's spaces, and they sort of have the jurisdiction to all the benefits in that area and so on. And interestingly also, it seems that this normative behavior arises within members of the same species. It's kind of this we group thinking idea. And we could maybe think of like certain species or animal communities of these sort of like little companies or organizations who have their own internalized norms. also, some species express their norms to embody the actions. For example, chimpanzees policing each other like human police officers, showing stop sign that stop that. And we could maybe even think in a very broad sense that these symbiotic transactions between companion species or some sort of like interspecies contracts about transactions, and you give me something, I don't eat you, kind of things. And normative behavior can be also seen as kind of norms of how there are rules for traffic or nest building and way to construct things in a more than human way. And the normative messages are conveyed through various signifiers, sounds, colors, sense, vibration, and yeah, so on. And what then seems to distinguish us humans from other types of normative agents, according to Tomasello and other researchers, is that we humans create this, that our new human normative obligation to behave in a certain way seems to stem from the collective sense that we and our internalized collaborative identity. So that when we fail to meet the obligations we have in the group, we might also lose this collaborative identity and also respect in that group. And I think this is noteworthy regarding also developing the post-human legalities and the more than human legalities, because I think this is the very fact that seems to influence our way of thinking about agency and who should be kind of belong to the in-group with us. Especially because there's research that indicates that this idea of we can vary between individuals due to cultural backgrounds. Some research indicates that indigenous cultures have this idea of shared we with more than human agencies, and they seem to be more acceptable to the idea than Western people living in urban cities, that there is this sort of multi-species justice we need to respect. In addition to these normativity studies, another path to explore the expansion of more than human agency could be to observe how agency can be enacted or enabled differently through different types of representation models or participatory practices. And Kurki and Sieminek have proposed the 3 standards of animal representation in law, from interest representation to listening and empowerment, which is feels very similar to how in participatory design research, researchers have explored the idea of inclusion and participation. And in my own article with Santiago de Francisco Vela, we use these different Go design frameworks to analyze the type of use of participation in legal design projects, to argue for that, I may have translated my time, that participation in law can be improved by paying attention to the participatory mindsets and the type of participatory methods that are being used. And what I want to say, that similar frameworks might be helpful when assessing more than human legal agency in practice too. And Rudowski, who is a key contributor in this more than human participation research, has proposed also his scale to assess and improve more than human participation in the decision making in urban design projects. He also notes that the exclusion or ignorance of more than humans in decision making that considers their interest is very similar to how marginalized human groups are being treated. So similar models that aim towards their better inclusion could also be used regarding more than human beings. The question, of course, that risks the exploration of more than human legal agency beyond the paternalistic and the passivity assumption is of course that how do we translate these ideas into some sort of practices. The post-human design approach suggests first moving beyond our human way of understanding and being in the world, which also of course means learning away from our old traditional and correct ways of being in relation with more than human beings. And they have also proposed their own list of different approaches, mindsets, methods that can help when delving into post-human legalities. First, prototyping, making ideas concrete in a material form to produce new insights and knowledge about the other beingness and their roles and our limitations to also explore them. Secondly, leaving or blurring the boundaries between humans and non-humans, the different types of ways of being, and also their norms, which creates a space to reimagine new legal structures and concepts. Thirdly, leaving the desire to stay inside this sort of safe and correct scientific worldview or understanding of things, because that can be limiting too. But just instead, just begin describing and performing the different ways of being in relation to more than human. That is how those new ways start to become real. Then being called upon or attuned by more than human needs to notice how we physically affect each other, regardless of what the law or legal philosophers say about more than human legal agency. Lastly, they point to the creation of spaces where humans do not rule the design process, but where different agencies can organically create the outcomes, enabling also learning what aligns these worlds, what are kind of in resonance, and what causes friction between them to work these frictions through. Okay, and now it's finally the most entertaining part coming up. The following examples might provide some food for thought, what that might look like in practice. The Designing Crisis Research Group has explored ways to design dog-friendly urban spaces with dogs by prototyping devices that help designers experience the space more from the dog's point of view. And the core insight here was that some technology most likely will be needed to give also agency to the designer to delve into the world of dogs. This is maybe one of the most known more than human design examples. Rudavsky and his colleagues have combined natural and artificial intelligences to work together to solve what kind of trees birds prefer to support ecosystem restoration in Australia. And what they were able to show is that the birds really do have a preference that they want to use old trees with big branches, which provides them, I guess, better safety. And again, this is also an interesting example. The Designing Crisis Research Group explored how to negotiate about human beaver territorial rights with beavers who had caused a lot of harm in this human populated area by causing recurring floods. And as part of their design exploration, they came up with this idea of creating a suit that the designer or architect could use to wear when negotiating with beavers on site by using particular odors or tubes that amplify certain beaver-sensitive sounds, like the sounds of water. Again, here the conclusion was that technology is needed and would help bridge the gap between the understandings between humans and more than human. And this idea is being explored also by the EU Policy Lab where they have applied speculative design to reimagine a world where we could actually sense and communicate with other intelligences, and what that could also add to policy making. And I've also put my, used some time to about this topic. In my own not yet published work, I have explored, perhaps less ambitiously, the idea about how to integrate nature's perspective to legal design using insights from nature, the biomimicry design approach. So, what I would like to propose is that maybe it is that the legal frameworks and practices need to change, and our ways of thinking regarding more than human legal agency. It just won't work out using our human-centered measuring sticks. Instead, we may have to expand and work with our concepts and practices, and through that gradually enable more than human participation in law. And then, of course, begins with acknowledging our human centricity and our agency limiting beliefs and assumption, and exploring that through different media. And maybe my main argument here is that understanding law as a form of design can help, as it points to the direction of concrete practices and materializations of law, where different ideas could be tested and new knowledge created in a very tangible form. It could also help navigate other human-centered elements of law, like the desired future behavior and the past bad behavior, which doesn't necessarily work with other beings that seem to live in an eternal now. And my only maybe the lege ferenda proposition is here that legislators would need to develop the more than human epistemic rights as a right to be known and be part of the knowledge production of designers of law and policy and so on. So that gradually through that engagement, the law would start developing towards accepting other ideas of more than human legal agency. And there are, of course, challenges on this path. Skepticism, first of all. These approaches may seem naive, utopistic, impractical, and it might be really hard for us to overcome this human way of understanding and being in the world, causing sort of different epistemic limitations. We may not really be able to know what is to be something else, and that can lead to wrong conclusions. By designing the space where more than humans are supposed to make their decisions, can cause this engineered atmosphere where actually the designed environment steers their decision making. And we tend to also favor certain species over others. And there's this naturalistic fallacy, of course, also, like Catherine Hales, the author of the book Bacteria to AI, reminds that the ecological relationality should actually scare the hell out of us, instead of us thinking that it's some sort of nice fluffy concept that we can perform our wokeness with. So that's it, and now I used my time so perfectly that you don't have time to ask me.